Welcome, everyone. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. This is the second event in our series honoring this year's winners of the 22 OPC awards. And today we're doing the Bob Considine Award for Best Newspaper, News Service, or Digital Interpretation of International Affairs. And it was won by Isabel Coles and Rena Effendi of the Wall Street Journal. And Rena also won the Feature Photography Award for pictures of the same subject. Their winning work is called Children of No Nation, a series that follows 7 siblings among thousands of children whose parents fled their own countries to join the Islamic State in Syria. The moderator is Peter Spiegel, U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times, who was the head judge of the panel that chose this piece of work to win the Considine Award. So one procedural issue, if you want to ask a question, please click the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the program. And when it's time for questions, we will unmute the people who ask questions one by one, and you can ask your question. Or if you want to ask a question by text, use the Q&A feature and one of us will read it out loud. So now I'm handing it over to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patty. And it is, I got to say, a great honor to be, I was going to say in the same room, but does this count as the same room? As Isabel and Rena. As Patty mentioned, I am U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times, but more importantly for this event, I chaired the judges for the Bob Considine Award. And very briefly, before I start the conversation, I just want to talk a bit about why we chose this work. For those of you who haven't read it, and please do, I read it again this morning, and to be honest with you, it almost brought me to tears again. I've read it now 3 or 4 times. It is such a moving piece. We had a lot of submissions, to be perfectly blunt with you, on Syria, and on the issue of foreign fighters and how European countries in particular were struggling with the return of foreign fighters to their nations. What really stood out about this is what we all hope to get as journalists, which is someone to tell the story through. And it was amazing to the extent to which, even when you're a reporter looking for that person, you hope that person brings the story home in the end. And it was amazing that this gentleman who became the main protagonist, Patricio Galvez, who's a Swede of Chilean immigrant to Sweden, not only did Isabel find him, connect with him, but then got to go to Syria with him, found the grandchildren, and then brought them back to Sweden in 3-part series that tracked their journey. Just incredibly moving work of journalism that brought the story home to our readers in the ways that other stories about Syria and even about this issue really didn't. So congratulations to the two of you. I got to say, and just start with I guess the obvious question, Isabel, I think because you were the person who first connected with the Galvez family. How did Patricio sort of, how did you track him down? How did you find him? And how did you get onto the story? Because it clearly it became a huge cause célèbre in Sweden in particular, but you had the access and you were the person who's got to spend all the time with him going into Syria and coming back.
Right, well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind words and for recognizing our work. I mean, the background to this is really that I had been covering the conflict with ISIS since 2014, really. So as things kind of came to a head last year, you know, the battle against ISIS came to a climax in eastern Syria. I went on assignment there to kind of cover those final operations. And while I was there, I wrote a story about how children from the Yazidi minority who had been kidnapped by Islamic State were emerging amongst the thousands of people who were being displaced by the military operations. So when that story was published, I got a message on Twitter completely out of the blue from someone saying, you know, we're desperately trying to find 7 kids. They're in Syria. This is their father's name. Do you have any information? I didn't have any information, but obviously I recognized immediately that it was a kind of potentially very interesting story. So I responded, and after exchanging a few messages, this person put me in touch with her uncle, who was Patricio Galvez. And we exchanged some messages, and, you know, from the very beginning, he had already been locked in this struggle for some time with the Swedish government. And he said from the very beginning, look, I want to go to Syria. And I asked if I could go with him. I mean, obviously, initially I went to Sweden. I wanted to kind of check that the story stacked up. And so I did that. I went to Sweden and I spent a week there kind of getting a sense of the backstory, which turned out to be, I think, a pretty crucial component of the series. And things kind of went from there. I mean, I think it was only maybe 2 or 3 weeks later that we then met in Erbil, and Rena joined us, and we followed him there.
Can I just ask you before we go on with the story? I'm just curious about your initial trip to Sweden, because as you mentioned in your story, the son-in-law. So Patricio is the main character. His daughter converts to Islam, marries a Swede who takes her essentially voluntarily into Syria, and he's the foreign fighter. The son-in-law, though, was a bit of a cause célèbre in Sweden at the time, because he had been shooting videos and had threatened Nordics, with violence. I'm curious how big an issue it was in Sweden at the time you entered the story.
I mean, it was a big issue. It was something that, throughout the time that they had spent in the caliphate, it was something that continually kind of came up in the tabloids. It was a kind of favorite issue. But I was thinking about this. I think one of the reasons that we were able to get the access that we did was because we came from outside that context. I didn't know who this Mikhail Skromo guy was until I started, looking into it. So I think the fact that we didn't have that kind of baggage kind of enabled us, or enabled Patricio to open up to us. Yeah.
Rena, can I ask, because you joined, I think, as Isabel said, in Erbil. Tell me a little bit about how you got involved in the story and some of the work you had done leading up to this.
So I got an email from the editor of the Wall Street Journal, photo editor of the Wall Street Journal, Margaret, and pitching the story and saying that we have a correspondent already in Sweden, and she's going to follow the man into Syria. And when I read that it was just one sentence: a grandfather going to rescue his 7 orphan children from Syria. I just, my heart sank. I felt like this is one of the most important stories I'd ever get a chance to work on. I have to be honest, I have not been to Syria before, previous to this assignment. I have not been to Iraq previously to this assignment. So I had, very little experience in that region. I have covered Syrian refugee crisis in Greece and in Turkey, but I haven't been to Syria or Iraq. But once again, when the story came to me, I jumped on it.
Isabel, I guess when you get to Erbil, what is your thinking? Because I've spent some time in the region, and although obviously never had a story like this, the logistics involved. I mean, I got to say that if someone was present to me and saying, I'm going to a refugee camp, and of course, the Al-Hol camp has become infamous for this. It's huge, hard to identify people, how to track people down. You have a guy here who has not met some of his grandchildren, don't even know what they look like. What was your hope in terms of actual success in tracking down the grandchildren?
Well, Patricio had already, in advance of going there, his former partner, so the maternal grandmother of the children, who also went to Syria, she had contacts with some of the women in the camp, including the woman who had taken care of these kids after both of their parents were killed. So he was actually getting most of the information about where these kids were. And then at the same time, on the side, I was trying to double check it, just to make sure that, we knew what we were getting into. So we had kind of established before going into Syria that, well, we thought 4 of the children were in this hospital. They had initially been in Al-Hol camp, and then they had been transferred to this hospital. So we went there expecting to find 4 of the kids, at least, in the hospital, and the rest of them in Al-Hol. So it wasn't we didn't go into it completely blind. Patricio was he obviously had the kind of main source of information, and we were just kind of like checking that, obviously.
So tell me a little about this journey here, because you describe it in part in the piece. I mean, obviously, the Iraq-Syria border at this time is a pretty difficult border to deal with. But then you also mentioned that the authority that was in control of the region where the hospital and the camp is was a sub-regional governor of even that. What was that kind of journey like for you and Rena?
Well, I think any journalist who has operated in northeast Syria would agree that it's a pretty complex environment. As you mentioned, it's controlled by this autonomous administration, and they control access pretty strictly to, you know, everywhere, all kind of key sites within the area under their control. And sometimes it's hard to know exactly why they are granting or denying access. So, I mean, the getting into Syria part was relatively straightforward, surprisingly so, apart from a sort of, there's like a floating bridge that you have to cross to enter Syria, and there was serious flooding when we intended to cross. So we got stuck for several days, and obviously Patricio was getting increasingly frustrated and desperate because he was so close and yet so far. But eventually we made it across, and then, you know, these access challenges began. So as I mentioned before, we had a pretty good idea that some of the kids were in this hospital. So that was our first port of call. And we sort of circumvented the procedures in order to get access. And which meant that once we were there, we got there, and we only, you know, Patricio only found one of the children there. The others had already been discharged.
Can I stop you on that one? Because that's the bit of the story where I started to break down. It's just an incredibly moving scene where you are with them. And Rena, you're there too, because you this iconic photo you captured of Patricio cradling his malnourished 1-year-old, I guess, probably less than 1-year-old grandson who he's never met before. Incredibly moving. Tell me a little bit about Rena in particular, you know, when you captured that image, what was going through your mind? Because again, for those who haven't read it, basically he's led into a room where there are dozens of unidentified babies, and he's never seen this grandchild before, and he's comparing it to his phone. Rena, if you could just talk me through about what's going through your mind in terms of the ability to capture that image, which, as I said, has really become iconic now.
Well, I mean, it was, as Isabel said, it was nerve-wracking because we sort of knew that the kids might be there, but we didn't know for sure. So we literally followed him inside the hospital, and he walks inside the hospital, and the only thing he has is a smartphone with a picture of Mohammed taken by somebody else. You know, he's never met the child, and he just asks doctors and nurses randomly, have you seen this child? Have you seen this child anywhere? And finally, he gets directed to the floor where, you know, where these like cribs, like children are lined up in cribs, and these are the children of foreign fighters. And he identifies Mohammed by the whiff of his blonde hair and the picture. He picks him up, and that's the moment when I think, I mean, it was very difficult for me to photograph because everybody became very emotional, and Patricio obviously became extremely emotional and began to cry and speak. He was speaking to Mohammed in Swedish. He was cradling the baby, and it was really such an emotional moment. I was crying. The nurses were crying. I think everybody around him were you know, very tense, but I kept photographing. I also felt like I needed to capture it in video, so I took some videos as well of this moment.
It really is amazing. I'm just curious. I mean, like Isabel, I'm a writer and come from a print background, but every time I talk to and work with photographers, they always say there's a lot of work going into any of those sort of iconic photos that win prizes. There's always a lot of work behind the scenes. I'm curious how you had prepared yourself for I don't know, either through positioning or developing a relationship with Patricio. Was there things that you did ahead of that really enabled you to position yourself to be in the right place at the right time?
This is a question for me or for Isabel?
No, for you, Rena. Like, again, yes. Dealing with photographers as I have in the past, a lot of them tell me that there's always groundwork that you don't see to get to that place.
Of course. I mean, like, it's building trust with the subject. You know, we've spent some days together. We've spent days being equally frustrated waiting for the border to open. We've spent days in the offices of various administrators telling us, no, not today, maybe tomorrow. And in that time of this, you know, there's this buildup, emotional buildup, and you start like, you know, feeling for him as well. You know, you want him to succeed. So of course, that's something, that's the time period that brings you closer together. And that's the moment when he forgets about the fact that I'm there. He forgets that I'm there. So he, you know, the most important thing for him is to pick up this child and cradle him in his arms. And I'm non-existent, you know, whatever, you know, my presence is not felt anymore. So, and that's the moment when the photograph really tells a story of Patricia, I think.
Isabel, let me turn back to you. I want to open the floor to Q&A because I'm already running a bit over. But tell me a little bit about your experience in that moment. I also don't want to get to spend some time to the next other two stories, because obviously I'm left sort of wondering what happens next, because I think the last story you ran was about 1.5 years ago. Patricia is actually back in Sweden now with the 3 grandchildren, but we're left with a bit of a cliffhanger there. So if I could just ask you to talk a bit about you know, what was going through your mind when you see Patricia actually finding the grandchild there at that moment. But then if you could just switch briefly to sort of where we are now, because I want to open the floor to questions as well. Sure.
I mean, yeah, as Rena said, it was very emotional, and I think afterwards I was scrawling things on a notepad while I was you know, witnessing this moment. And then of course later on I looked at my notepad and there was nothing really there. But it didn't matter, you know, because it was just just something that you couldn't really forget. So it didn't really matter. But yeah, it was very intense. So if I could just very quickly, just summarize for those who haven't read the stories, it is, again, it folds amazingly. You know, the one child is found in the hospital, but the other 6 have been sent back to the camp. You are able to go to the camp, find the other children after a series of bureaucratic challenges. They are reunited. Story 2 is the story about him flying back to Frankfurt, transferring planes, flying to Gothenburg. And then story 3 is heartbreaking, because what happens is, because for perfectly legal and understandable reasons, the Swedish authorities basically decide that they need to separate the children from the grandfather. So they're basically celebrities when they arrive in Sweden, to sort of anonymize them, to make sure that they are raised anonymously. The grandfather Patricio is struggling and feels guilty now that he's brought them back, because clearly the grandchildren want to see each other and they've been separated. And we're sort of left, again, I think it's December of last year, December 2019, where, so I guess only about 6 months ago, where we're left with sort of Patricio in many ways regretting in some ways what he did. Regretting is maybe too strong a word, but I'm just curious if you've been in touch with him, and tell me about that Isabel, if you could, that sort of that closing chapter that you had to cover, which is, again, not only gets to a human story, an emotional story, but just what you want in journalism, raises the bigger issues that Europe was dealing with and is still dealing with, about repatriating Islamic State fighters and their children. Yeah, sure. I mean, I was in touch with him a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, the kids were initially in a kind of like a foster home, but an institution, and then gradually they were placed with different foster families. And so it's only 2 weeks ago that the last kids were placed with foster families, so taken out of that institution. And I mean, the sense, you know, there are certainly, as you say, I mean, there have been moments where I think it's been extremely difficult for him dealing with the kind of the consequences, really, and dealing with the social services. But I think increasingly he's kind of reconciling himself to the situation. Certainly it sounded that way a few weeks ago, but it was. Yeah, do you get a sense in terms of, I mean, again, the children, it's hard to glean since you're not in direct contact with them, but what was really moving to me was this sense that the children were angry at the grandfather for having separated them, and that they have not been able to actually get back together as a group of 7. Has there been any advancement on that effort? Well, I mean, the interesting thing about that, which I think I attempted to convey in the story is that, you know, it wasn't really clear whether they really did resent him or whether it was just his own, you know, him projecting his own sort of feelings of guilt onto them. He hasn't mentioned that again, so perhaps, you know, now that a bit of time has passed, he has, you know, shared some images of them with me, which are just amazing. I mean, they look kind of plump and
with hair,
not at all like they did in Syria. Yeah.
Rena, let me ask you one last question, and just to remind everyone, Chad is going to help me with the OPC with taking questions. You know, raise your hand. There's also a chat function here if you want to pop your question in there, and I can read them off from there. But Rena, again, I just want to get at your experiences in Sweden, because you did actually go back for this final piece. And again, this is a man and a family who had become, in some ways, victimized is a loaded word, but he had become the subject of a lot of tabloid journalism in Sweden, and, you know, including from photographers sort of surreptitiously taking pictures of him in Frankfurt on the way back. Again, as you arrive in Sweden and you're allowed access at a time that clearly his relationship with the local press is a little bit difficult. Tell me how you were able to sort of, you know, rekindle that relationship and shoot the stuff you did, which is obviously less sort of news and impactful than the first piece, but still has that incredibly evocative of him even just sort of playing a guitar in his apartment by himself, and it really kind of, you know, brings that story home. How were you able to sort of rekindle that relationship at a time that he had clearly had a pretty difficult time with photographers in Sweden?
I think from the outset in the story, as also Isabel mentioned, we've positioned ourselves in a very different way. We weren't sensational. We weren't there for a scoop. We were there to tell a human story from the very beginning. We followed him from the very first day all the way to the last, you know, trip. We were on the airplane with him and the kids going back home. We were there when the kids were given, you know, to the social services, and then we went back. And I think in a way, because we've built that relationship over a course of several months and several trips, and, you know, being there with him, being in the room when he has reunited with the kids and brought them back to Erbil, waiting for him for a week to get permission to leave Erbil, you know, throughout the entire journey, pretty much. I think in that time, we were the only ones who had that access, and we were the only ones who've built that relationship, which was, you know, very close and trusting. And it wasn't something that, you know, when I went back to Sweden, it was almost like seeing a friend, you know, and I chat with him, you know, Isabel spoke to him 2 weeks ago. We also chat, you know. So we've really built a rapport. And I think because we were not in a position of just, you know, journalists running after a quick story, which could do more damage than good to his efforts, because we stuck with him from the very beginning. I think it wasn't something he was ready to jeopardize or wanted to jeopardize. I think he accepted us back with arms, you know, outstretched, and we were the only ones pretty much who were able to, you know, to access him, and who he allowed to photograph children with faces, you know. So it was a longer relationship.
All right, let me go, Chad. Why don't I start with the question in the chat room here from Nick Mueller. Same question I actually had. Will you revisit the story again at some point? Because again, I sort of felt like I wanted to know more of how Patricio and the family was doing. Has there been a lasting impact of your reporting? I would just also say, from the judge's perspective, that was part of the reason we were drawn to this story. Is it has had an impact not only in Sweden but throughout Scandinavia in terms of, and throughout Europe in terms of galvanizing countries to actually pay attention to this issue and deal more forthrightly with foreign fighters that are their nationals. And one of the numbers, if we know, when it comes to Sweden more widely and in Europe.
Sure. I mean, in terms of future or further work on the subject, obviously it's a little bit harder now because of the access issues back in Sweden. I would love to, I would love to revisit the story in 10 years' time, you know, when these kids are grown up and old enough to decide, you know, whether they, you know, want to speak to a journalist. But in the near term, we don't have any plans to write anything else on it.
And what was it? The second part of the question is, what in terms of the impact you think your stories have? What was the most important thing for you in terms of setting an agenda or getting this issue right? What was the most rewarding? I guess the question I'm asking in terms of the impact that you think the stories have had.
Well, there was the impact in this, you know, within the context of this specific case, which, I mean, it's hard to, you know, we don't have really an insight into the room where the kind of Swedish officials made the decision to bring these kids back. So we don't really know what the tipping point was. But I think, you know, I think it's fair to say that the media had a pretty kind of instrumental role in compelling the Swedish government to bring these kids back. So that's kind of, you know, a direct consequence. In terms of the kind of, you know, the wider impact, it certainly, you know, prior to the case involving Patricio, only some French children had been repatriated following the fall of the caliphate last year. And since then, there have been sort of a flurry of repatriations, which are still, you know, only a fraction of the total, and are only really, have only been really in the case of orphans. It's a lot more complicated when it comes to the children whose mothers survived, because separating a child from their mother, you know, that is obviously, you know, different and has kind of implications in terms of international humanitarian law. So I think the last statistics, there are still around 8,000 foreign children in Syria. Since 2017 until last year, they've repatriated about 800, but 90% of those were repatriated by Russia, Kosovo, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan, yeah.
Yeah. So still, I mean, the issue is, it looks like, I mean, the issue will remain for many years to come, and particularly now, obviously, with the coronavirus, it's completely or largely kind of stalled what little kind of effort or will there was towards repatriation.
Chad, why don't I turn it over to you to if there are people who put their hands up in the room.
Great. We have Bill Holstein, who should now be unmuted. Bill, you are welcome to ask a question now.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are.
Well, pleased to be in the same room with you, Peter. And so my wife and I, Rena Effendi, sponsored this award, and so we're delighted to see that it's gone to such a worthy pair of intrepid journalists, and delighted you have been honored for your work. My question would be,
thank you.
If I were an editor and you came to me and said, I want to go track down a Chilean-Swedish guy in Gothenburg, whatever it's called, and then I want to try to follow him into Syria, where there are thousands of children have been abandoned or you know, been in some sort of crisis, and it's in the middle of a war zone. How did you persuade your editor to send you on this mission, and how long did it take altogether?
It actually wasn't very hard. I mean, I think they saw, or I managed to, you know, they saw the kind of potential of the story from pretty early on. I was in London when I had that initial kind of connection with Patricio's niece, and so I just you know, I pitched it, and they agreed for me to go to Sweden, and you know, it sort of happened one step at a time. But we didn't, I mean, the Wall Street Journal was extremely supportive and gave us, you know, all the resources and time that we needed to pursue it, and didn't seem to think that it was a crazy proposition.
It was actually unparalleled. You know, the amount of time and dedication that the editorial office put to the story, for me, that was incredible. I think the support that they gave in the 6 months. I mean, it took us about 6 months to complete all the stories, right, Isabel? It was about 6 months journey altogether. So, and you know, even sort of the public response, as I've been reading comments, people wanted to know what happens next. You know, they wanted to, you know, when he brought the children back, there were comments on social media from people saying, so can you tell us what's happening next? How are the children going to be? So the fact that I think we got this kind of support was also maybe warranted by the public interest in some way.
I can also say, as a former Wall Street Journal reporter myself who covered the wars, and as an editor now, I can say all editors are benevolent and wise in all things. So I think that was Chad, is there someone else who wants to pop in here?
We do not have any questions lined up. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please do either raise your hand or use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to you soon.
Isabel, let me ask you as a follow-up in terms of, you know, it's a little bit of my last question, as sort of the reaction to your third story. I'm curious as to what extent you now see this as sort of part of your beat or part of the story that you want to tell, that even outside of Patricio's story, that the issue of foreign fighters in repatriation is something that you've been following. Obviously, as you said, the momentum has been sort of halted with everything else going on in the world, but to what extent have you sort of made this your area of expertise because of the success you had with this story?
I mean, it's certainly an issue that I'm planning to continue reporting on and to return to. I just, you know, it's part of a broader kind of regional beat. So it's I guess, you know, carving out the kind of the time to be able to pursue that. But, you know, I think it's clearly a very rich theme. I mean, Rena and I actually returned, we did actually do a fourth story, which perhaps wasn't submitted as part of the package.
I think there was a cutoff on dates for the end of the year, yeah.
Oh, right, okay. So we actually returned to Syria in order to find these kids after their parents were killed. They were entrusted to a Finnish woman who was the second wife of the father, of the kid's father. So we attempted to track her down and managed actually on that occasion to get access to Al-Hol. Unfortunately, she, you know, we couldn't persuade her to speak. So I mean, that's one of the threads that I still feel like there's so much more that could be done even on this story. But
and Patricio himself has said that he would like to go back himself. He had a picture, I think, that's in the third story of the burying place of his daughter, and would like to go back to recover the remains. Has he been able to pursue that at all, or?
I mean, it's something that he continues to bring up, you know, in the most recent conversations that I've had with him. And I feel some responsibility to say that, you know, this is just, I mean, he's shown me that the extent of the information that he has about the location of this grave is, you know, it's between village X and village Y. I just don't think that there is, and that area is also quite insecure. So I just don't think there's any possibility that he is ever going to be able to do that. I think for him, he's obviously very keen to find out more about his daughter. And the only way that he could really do that, I think, is by speaking to some of the women who knew her when she was living, you know, in Syria, in the caliphate. The problem is that they are all quite hostile to him because they have a relationship with his ex-partner, and he and his ex-partner are at odds. So I think he would find it very difficult to persuade these, which is really, I mean, it's obviously sad, you know, because I think he feels that there's so much that he doesn't understand, and you know, perhaps never will.
Rena, can I ask you the same question which I asked Isabel, which is, as you said in your opening remarks, you had not been to Iraq before, you had not been to Syria before, you're based in Istanbul. Just curious in terms of how has this story changed your career? I mean, is this something now that you foresee yourself doing a bit more of, or are you sort of back in your normal freelance topics?
Yeah, I mean, we went back. Actually, the story, the fourth story was submitted for the for the OPC awards, and I won the photography award.
Oh, okay. We didn't get it.
So we did go back, and we couldn't find the subject that we were looking for, but we talked to other women, and I found myself kind of, because I speak Russian, I'm a Russian speaker, I found myself swarmed by women who spoke Russian, and 4 of them were from Azerbaijan, where I'm from. And I started talking to them, and I photographed one of them, and I sort of got to know them in a very brief time period that we were allowed to be there. Very briefly, their stories. And then I've been giving interviews to Azerbaijani local media, and there's over 200 women and children from Azerbaijan still in Al-Hol. And I've been, contacted by an NGO that's trying to repatriate the people, sort of about the information, the basic logistics of how to get there. I have taken the story to Davos, the World Economic Forum, and I've presented it in Davos. And that was the story of Patricio, and also in a framework of, there are still 8,000 children, foreign children completely abandoned in this camp, and it's a humanitarian disaster that the world has chosen to largely ignore. And so I have been kind of taking it to several platforms with talks. And yes, again, when the opportunity presents itself, it would be something that I'd like to continue working on for sure.
Isabel, the one story we didn't really talk about much is the second story. I avoided slightly because my question I had for you was a little bit inside baseball, but I guess this is the Overseas Press Club, so I'll ask the inside baseball question. And because as a journalist, part of the drama there to me is you are in the plane, arriving in Frankfurt, in the plane, arriving in Gothenburg. Rena, I can tell from your photographs, I think you actually got separated with the family when they arrive, where they're avoiding other reporters. And I'm just curious, given the intense interest in Sweden in particular, that other reporters and other media organizations had in this story, how did your relationship go with some of your Swedish rivals, for lack of a better word? Because I must imagine that they were so hungry to get the story, and perhaps a bit resentful that these foreigners from American publication were getting the inside story when they weren't.
Well, we did. We had a bit of a run-in in Syria with the Swedish media, because we had obviously accompanied him when he was entering Syria, and then he had given an interview to Swedish national television on the eve of his departure, and it was broadcast, I think, the day that he entered Syria. So there happened to be, some Swedish and other Scandinavian journalists in Syria at the time. And they obviously found out that he was there. And then, so they were basically like trying to find him and us, which was really a problem. I mean, given the kind of complex environment there, it's really, you kind of want to keep as low a profile as possible. You don't really want the authorities to kind of, think that you're doing anything unusual. And so there was a pretty, there was one moment where I think some Swedish media tipped off the administration that we were in this hospital. So then the intelligence summoned us, and we thought that, they might tell us to leave. So that was pretty fraught, but it resolved itself. But apart from that, actually, once we were in Sweden, we didn't really meet any of the Swedish media. We appeared in some of their paparazzi shots getting off the plane in Gothenburg, but apart from that, no, we didn't really.
And the one thing that was slightly amazing to me, the detail that caught my eye, I always say there's certain details that I think we all put in stories to impress other journalists. And the one I liked in particular was the fact that during the transfer in Frankfurt, a Swedish tabloid reporter happened to get a shot of them transferring in Frankfurt that was already in the Swedish papers by the time you had arrived there. Do you know how that transpired?
I think, there were people when we were waiting at the transfer desk, there were people they recognized him clearly, and someone must have been taking photographs on their on their phone, and it was just uploaded. You know, by the time we arrived, one of Patricio's friends who was helping him out, she checked, you know, the tabloid sites, and there was the picture from Frankfurt Airport. So, yeah.
Rena, can I ask you, because another thing that struck me about that second story is, again, another incredibly moving image of all the children on an airline seat together, sort of looking like regular old children flying home from any holiday or anything like that. You mentioned that you've been the only organization that has been allowed to publish photos of their faces. And I'm just curious about that decision, because, again, in the third story, one of the concerns of the Swedish authorities is, how do we anonymize these children and allow them to have a normal upbringing if their face is in the press? You know, there obviously was a decision taken, and you as a photographer yourself had to sort of, I guess, weigh the decision of using children's faces in the story. Tell me a little bit about that thought process.
Well, I mean, for me personally, I felt like taking their faces, pixelating the faces would dehumanize them, especially in the beginning of the story when you are, you know, when you want to put a human face, because, you know, these children are branded as children of ISIS and they're already dehumanized enough. And when you're wiping out their faces, you know, there's no compassion there. There's no understanding of the issue. So, so from the very beginning, I kind of, you know, I talked to the editors and we decided that, and I talked to Patricio as well, and he was comfortable with us using the faces for that particular reason, you know, because it brings a human face to this tragic situation, without which it's hard to, you know, to develop empathy. So, and then in the end, I think what also helped was the fact that Wall Street Journal is not a Swedish tabloid, and it's not as read by the Swedish public as, you know, of course we are in the age of internet, everything gets shared, but there's still a big difference, I think. The worry is mostly for these kids to be recognized in Sweden, and I think chances of the wider public reading the Wall Street Journal and seeing the faces of the children in the Wall Street Journal are perhaps not as much as, you know, if they would be published by a Swedish tabloid, you know.
And Isabel, you mentioned in the story that by the third time the third story, that the children were almost unrecognizable from the ones you had met 6 months earlier in terms of nutrition.
Yeah, I was about to add that I think, you know, I mean, even now, I think it would be difficult for people who saw those images to recognize them as the same kids. And I know that Rena was also, you know, I think you tried to choose photos that weren't, you know.
Exactly. I was going to add that, you know, when I was photographing them, I was going for shots where they're a little bit more obscured, where the faces are half turned, where there's shadow, you know, sort of not like, you know, other than the baby. I think the baby is the closest that I've gotten to. And then he's completely unrecognizable now. He's gained weight and you can't, you know, it's completely two different people. But the other kids too, when I was photographing them, I was being sensitive and mindful of the fact that perhaps I should photograph them from an angle where they're not completely recognizable. But yet, you know, their faces are seen because, again, I think it dehumanizes them to just pixelate or put black squares on their faces.
Isabel, one last thing on this point before I go back to the room. You in the third story, again, you mentioned there was some, particularly in social media, reaction that, you know, if I ever find out that these children are in the school with my kids, I'm going to pull them out and that kind of thing. I'm just curious, has Patricio in any way communicated to you whether the kids have been identified or have had any sort of backlash because they are the son, daughter of an ISIS fighter?
I mean, I think he would have, you know, we speak often enough that I think he would have mentioned that if it had happened, and he hasn't. There was this one hostile encounter that he himself had not long after returning to Sweden, which I mentioned in the third story. But beyond that, I think it's just been, there was at the time when this was kind of unfolding, there was some vitriol on social media, but it hasn't sort of spilled out beyond that. And I met the former head of intelligence in Gothenburg, and to kind of get a sense of the extent to which security concerns were kind of factoring into the social services decision to try to anonymize the kids. And he didn't see any kind of major threat to the kids. There wasn't anything that they had, picked up on. Yeah.
Let me turn. Bill has just pinged me and wants to chime in as well. Bill, let me turn it back to you for a question again.
You mentioned that the situation was still unstable in northeastern Syria, but I thought the caliphate had been completely destroyed. So what are the different forces vying for power there, and why is it so unstable?
So it's controlled by this autonomous administration, which is Kurdish-led. So in fact, on a second attempt to go to Syria, we entered, on the day that we entered, Turkey invaded northeast Syria because they consider the group that kind of dominates within this administration to be an offshoot of a terrorist group. So, I mean, that's created some, that's destabilized what had previously been a fairly secure part of Syria, certainly, in relative to the rest of the country. And actually, even, more recently, you're seeing, following the Turkish incursion, you're seeing also Russian forces increasingly trying to expand their presence and influence in this area, which has been a kind of, the US has a presence in that part of Syria. So you've got the kind of big power politics, and also ISIS, which, although it's lost its caliphate and it's territorially defeated, it's reverted to insurgent tactics, and obviously will look for any kind of opportunity to any kind of chaos to exploit. So it's still fairly unstable.
Let me turn to Nick Mueller has another question. The role of female journalists, particularly in this region. I think he's asking whether there are advantages to being a female reporter that may make stories more difficult for their male counterparts. My experience, having reported from Iraq primarily, is that it's actually a bit the other way, that because it's a rather a male-dominated society, that's sometimes easier with a male reporter with a pack of cigarettes to walk up and report than it is for a female reporter. But I'm just curious as to what extent, perhaps in Sweden or even with Patricio, the fact that whether you felt that the fact that both of you are women helped in any way or helped your reporting in the region?
In the region or in?
Yeah, his question is, what advantage do you see as female journalists reporting in the region? Does it make some stories possible that wouldn't be for male reporters?
In general, I would say yes. In relation to this particular story, it's hard to say, really. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Rena?
I think, in terms of access, perhaps, it would be easier for a woman, less threatening for a woman to cover other women's stories in the region, especially with all the cultural sensitivities that are present. To be honest, I don't know, I haven't really felt any special advantages other than, being a woman makes it not as threatening to come into someone's home and meet their family and be around their kids. People open up easier to a woman than to a man, perhaps. But again, it's all personal. It depends on how you behave and how good you are in terms of winning trust. I think men can do it as well as women.
Yeah, I'm wary of making generalizations.
Yeah,
I think there are definitely sort of certain contexts where it's an advantage, like in the in Al-Hol camp, for example.
Al-Hol, I was gonna say, they're all women. I mean, if we were, would they speak as openly to a man if you know, if a man were to walk out, and would they open up? I don't know.
Let me ask you again a
hard.
little bit of the story, which I was not fleshed out that much, but I'm intrigued by. Again, if I could just do the family tree, we have Patricio, obviously the main character here. His daughter, who has been killed, she is married to a Swedish Muslim. His family declined to cooperate with you, although I guess Patricio is in touch with the father. Talk to me a little bit about your efforts to reach out to his family and why that proved so fraught.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, I would have spoken to all the relatives. I mean, all the grandparents. But it just wasn't possible. I mean, on my first trip to Sweden, I put letters through their doors and requested it, and they declined. I mean, so Patricio hasn't been on speaking terms with the mother of his son-in-law, so the maternal grandmother, for quite some time, really. And in some ways, I think, managing these relationships was really one of the challenges, because there was this kind of feud within the family. Automatically, by positioning yourself or even sort of speaking to one member of the family, the others kind of viewed you as being in the enemy camp. So it was impossible to overcome that with the maternal grandmother. The paternal grandfather, he has sort of been out of the picture for a long time and actually no longer lives in Sweden. I mean, the really, to me, very fascinating figure was Patricio's ex-partner, so the mother of his daughter. And she initially refused to speak to me. When I was in Sweden, I tried, and she wouldn't get back to me. But then she did get in touch, and then we were in contact sort of intermittently. And I actually really would have liked to spend more time with her, because I actually think she holds the key to large parts of the story. She actually, she's the one who knew that she spent time with her daughter in Syria. She spent the most time with those kids, and it was just unfortunate that I wasn't able to. She would occasionally kind of open up to me, and then she's really had a lot of very difficult encounters with the tabloid press in Sweden. Yeah. So is extremely suspicious, and would occasionally open up, and then something would happen and she would become sort of hostile. But I mean, I think I'm
just curious on that point, because you mentioned two factors here. One is the tense relationship with Patricio, and then the sort of her bad experience with the press in general. I mean, again, for those who haven't read the stories, what is compelling about her is she does actually, at her daughter's insistence, not only convert to Islam herself, but then does travel with the family into Syria. Eventually leaves and is able to come back to Sweden before there was a clampdown. But then also there's this dramatic scene during the reunion where Patricio allows her to come and visit the children, and she starts playing Quran verses to the children, and Patricio is very upset about that. I'm curious, your inability to sort of, I don't know, win her over is the wrong side, but at least get more access to her. Do you think it was more the tension within the family as you described, or was it her sort of concern about her treatment in the tabloid press in Sweden, or is it a combination?
I think it was more to do with her relationship with Patricio. When their relationship was kind of okay, she would talk to me, and then as soon as that relationship broke down, she would kind of view me as being in his camp and wouldn't engage with me. Because she spoke to ITV, so she did have some, she did speak to some media, but she was a few months ago actually was in the tabloids again, because a reporter in Sweden posed as someone who was collecting funds to enable women in Al-Hol to escape from the camp, and she fell for it. So she met with this reporter, and then he revealed who he was, and she had come with a bag of cash, I think, to hand over to him. And I tried to make contact with her again recently. Just, I mean, you know, I'd be interested in revisiting the story at some point. So I thought it's worth trying to create, you know, build this relationship.
Yeah,
but,
and I guess as a reporter, I mean, again, your work was so even-handed and so deeply reported, and I think hopefully in many ways, those who are involved in the story will have read it and see how fair and equitable you were in the story. So again, congratulations. Chad, let me just check in with you one last time to make sure there's no other questions before I sort of wrap things up here.
We do not have any questions queued up.
Well, great. Let me just again congratulate Rena and Isabel for what is a fabulous work of journalism. And it's as a judge of one of these panels, it's always a bit bittersweet because it's very rewarding for me as a journalist to honor journalists like you who have accomplished this kind of feat, but also it's bitter because I wish I could have done that kind of story. So congratulations. And Patty, let me turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rena, Isabel, and Peter. It was a fascinating behind-the-scenes discussion and dealt with a lot of ethical issues that are very complicated. And so it was a really revealing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.